All right, let's dive in. Today we're looking into this Brangelina thing, this divorce that's been going on forever. Seems like it's finally over. You sent over this Daily Mail article and some pretty intense Reddit comments about it. And
Yeah.
it seems like there's a lot to unpack. We've got the financial side of things, the abuse allegations, and public opinion.
Yeah, I think this one's really interesting because it touches on the stuff you see with a lot of these high-profile divorces, right? Like all this
Hmm.
money involved, and then you add in these really serious allegations, and
Yeah.
it gets complicated.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so to start, the Daily Mail is saying that after like 8 years of legal battles, it's finally over. Officially divorced.
Officially done.
Officially done. And Jolie's walking away $80 million richer. But it's more complicated than just Pitt writing a check.
Right, yeah. It's not just a payout. They had a prenup, so anything they had before the marriage stayed separate. So this 80 million, it's a bunch of things, like loans she had to repay, money from art sales. And the biggest chunk is from Jolie selling her part of their French estate, Chateau Miraval, to the Stoli Group.
Chateau Miraval, that's that huge estate in France, right? The one with the vineyards.
That's the one. Yeah, it was a big deal for them, financially, obviously. But it seemed like it meant a lot to them personally, too.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And the Daily Mail actually said they were planning to keep it in the family, for the kids to inherit. But I guess things don't always work out the way you plan.
Yeah, well, especially with this whole fight over who owns it now. Definitely not going as planned. But it is wild how, like, these financial details get so tied up with everything else in a divorce,
Mhm.
Especially for a couple like this, where everything they do is
Like under a microscope.
under a microscope. Yeah.
Yeah. And speaking of things under a microscope, the Daily Mail sort of mentions the abuse allegations, but that Reddit thread goes deep, especially about the incident on that plane back in 2016.
Yeah, it's rough. The Redditors are referencing this FBI report that goes into detail about what happened on that flight. They're saying Brad was physically and verbally abusive towards Jolie and the kids.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and they're quoting specifics from the report, too, like saying Pitt grabbed her, shook her, even punched the ceiling of the plane, and that he, like, lunged at one of the kids who tried to get in between them.
It's intense. Some of it's really hard to read, like the stuff about him choking one kid and hitting another while the others tried to, like, protect each other. It's just, ugh, it's hard to square that with, like, the Brad Pitt we all thought we knew, you know?
It is, and it's interesting that, well, according to these sources anyway, no charges were ever filed, even though the FBI investigated it. Makes you wonder.
Yeah, it really does. And that's where the public reaction gets interesting. That Reddit thread is just, wow, people are furious. So many people are calling him a monster, a deadbeat dad, the works.
You really see how this incident has changed how people view their whole divorce.
Hmm.
Like, the Daily Mail article kind of makes it sound like Jolie is the one who dragged it out, but the Redditors are basically saying she's just trying to protect herself and her kids after all this.
It's like two completely different stories, but it seems like, at least on Reddit, people are on Jolie's side, which makes me think, what does this mean for Pitt? For his career? We've seen other celebrities,
Yeah, their careers just tank after stuff like this.
totally.
It's a really complex issue. It's hard to say what will happen. We'll have to see how it plays out. But before we go there, I think it's important to consider the kids in all of this. I mean,
They're the ones stuck in the middle of this whole mess. And from what we're seeing, it sounds like things between Pitt and his kids are really strained. Like, the Daily Mail says he's paid something like $9 million in child support,
at least that much, yeah.
at least that much. But then Reddit is saying that the kids haven't even talked to Pitt's family.
Right. And that Maddox, their oldest, took Pitt's name off, well, his name.
Wow. Yeah, that's a pretty big statement. This whole thing, it makes you wonder what the long-term impact is going to be on these kids.
For sure. It really shows you how important it is to have support, resources for families going through this. Famous or not, it's...
It's a good reminder that, yeah, this is a celebrity thing, but it's also just a family falling apart, you know?
Exactly.
And it's rough. And, it makes you think, what about these allegations? How are people reacting to them? Because there's such a difference between how the Daily Mail talks about it and how the Reddit comments are talking about it.
Yeah, there is. What are you noticing?
I mean, the Daily Mail is all about the money, right? Like, that's the main focus. They kind of just brush over the abuse part. But on Reddit, it's all anyone's talking about. It's like they're analyzing every single detail.
It's almost like they're more invested in the abuse allegations than the Daily Mail is.
Totally. And it makes you wonder, like, how much does public opinion really matter? Because it seems like the public, at least on Reddit, has already made up their minds.
Yeah, and it's interesting how that public opinion, how that differs from what the media is putting out there. It makes you think about how those two things kind of work together, or sometimes against each other.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we see that a lot. But okay, before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's get back to the money for a second.
Okay, yeah, the money. I mean, the Daily Mail actually broke down their net worths. It's kind of crazy to see.
Oh, yeah, it was like a peek into like what crazy rich Hollywood people are worth.
Yeah, exactly. So they're saying Brad is worth like $400 million
Mm-hmm.
just from movies and his businesses and real estate.
400 million.
Yeah.
Jeez.
And Jolie, she's not quite at that level, but still, they say she's worth around 160 million
Mm.
from acting. And she's got that new fashion line, Atelier Jolie, that's probably doing pretty well too.
Yeah, she's doing all right. I guess even though this 80 million is huge, it's like a drop in the bucket for them, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
But it does make you think about like, what are they going to do with all this money? How does this change their lives, going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the Daily Mail mentioned that Brad actually loaned Angelina like 8 million bucks to buy that massive house in LA where she lives with the kids.
Oh, yeah, the one that used to belong to like some old Hollywood director, right?
Yeah. Cecil B. DeMille. Talk about a fancy address.
No kidding. So wait, that 8 million is part of the 80 million she got. So she basically got like a free house in the divorce.
Pretty much, yeah. That's a pretty good deal if you ask me, especially in LA. And then there's that 11.5 million she made from selling that painting Brad gave her, the Winston Churchill one. Makes you wonder what other crazy expensive stuff they've got in their art collection.
It's a whole different world, right? But okay, the big one. That's 64 million from selling her part of Chateau Miraval. That's got to be the main thing, right?
Definitely. It shows you that even in these messy divorces, someone can end up making a lot of money. And for Jolie, that money's probably going to be really important for her and the kids moving forward.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that this isn't just about, who gets to keep the fancy house or the expensive art. This is about real people and a family trying to figure out their lives.
Exactly. And it shows you that even with all this money and fame, they still have to deal with the same kind of stuff regular people go through in a divorce.
All right, so we've talked about the money, the abuse allegations, and a little bit about the kids, but we got to talk about the public reaction. That Reddit thread is wild. What are your thoughts on how those comments are shaping how people see this whole thing?
Well, the first thing that jumps out is just how much anger there is towards Brad Pitt.
Yeah, it's intense.
Mhm.
Like, people are calling him a monster, a deadbeat dad. Some are even comparing him to other celebrities who've had, similar accusations made against them.
Right, like there were a lot of comments about Johnny Depp and that whole thing with Amber Heard, and then Justin Baldoni, and yeah, people are bringing up all those cases.
Yeah, and it makes you think, like, how much of this is about PR, Like, is this all just media spin?
It's a good question because social media has so much power these days.
Mhm.
Celebrities aren't just like actors or whatever anymore, they're brands, and those brands can be pretty fragile.
And it definitely seems like Brad's brand is, like, seriously hurting right now. People are saying they'll never watch another one of his movies, that they've lost all respect for him.
Uh-huh. And on the flip side, you've got all this support for Jolie.
Mm-hmm.
People are saying she's so strong, so brave for speaking out
Mm-hmm.
and for, putting her kids first. Some people are even calling her like a symbol for other people who have survived abuse.
Yeah, it's almost like she's become, like, this folk hero,
Mm.
which is weird because she's always been kind of a mystery, right? Like this Hollywood rebel.
Mm.
It seems like these allegations against Pitt have really changed how people see her.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, before this, she was known as like the glamorous actress, the humanitarian.
Mm.
But now she's like this like symbol of strength, this woman who's standing up to abuse and protecting her kids.
It's a powerful story. And I mean, the Daily Mail does say that Brad denies all of this. They said he claims he's been working on himself, that he's sober now,
Mm.
but it seems like the public has already made up its mind.
Yeah. Whether or not these allegations are ever actually proven, like in court, I think the damage to his reputation is already done. And it makes you wonder, how do we as a society deal with these accusations, especially when it's someone rich and powerful?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because is it different when it's a celebrity versus, a regular person? Do they get treated differently?
Right. Yeah, do they? That's something to think about, especially when we look at the custody arrangement in this case. The Daily Mail said that Jolie has primary custody and that Pitt gets visitation rights. But then there's the stuff on Reddit.
Right, like how the kids supposedly haven't even spoken to Pitt's family. And that Maddox thing, taking Pitt's name out of his name.
It's a lot. Like,
Yeah.
it really seems like things are totally broken between them. And it just
Yeah.
makes you think about, like, what's the impact going to be on these kids, years down the line.
I know, they've been through so much. Not just this alleged abuse, but this whole thing being so public, you know?
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, it's got to be a lot to process. It makes you realize how important it is to have support systems, counseling, all of that for any family going through something like this, famous or not.
It's hard enough as it is.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about the allegations, the emotional toll, all that. But let's not forget about the money. It's a huge part of this story.
Oh, yeah. The money, we were talking about their net worths before, how the Daily Mail laid it all out. It's a lot to take in.
Right. Like $400 million for Brad. It's insane.
Yeah, it is. It's crazy to think about. And then you've got Jolie, who's worth like 160 million. It's like, even though this 80 million is a massive amount of money, it's still just a small part of what they have.
Yeah, it puts things in perspective, right? But it does make her pretty well off, all things considered, especially as she's raising 6 kids on her own.
And that's what's important, right? It's easy to get lost in the dollar figures, but what does this money really mean for them going forward? What will it allow them to do?
Well, I mean, remember how the Daily Mail mentioned that Brad loaned Angelina $8 million to buy that huge mansion in LA?
Oh, yeah, the Cecil B. DeMille house.
That's the one. So since that loan is part of the $80 million, it's like she basically got a free mansion out of the divorce.
A free mansion. That's a pretty good deal if you ask me. And then there's that 11.5 million from selling the Winston Churchill painting. What I wouldn't give to see the kind of art collection these people have.
Right, it's like a whole other world. But let's not forget about the big one, Chateau Miraval. That sale was huge.
$64 million. That probably makes up most of what Jolie gained. It shows you that sometimes, even in a divorce, things can work out financially, especially if you've got valuable assets like that.
Exactly. And that money is going to be crucial for Jolie, making sure her kids are taken care of, building a secure future for them.
It's easy to lose sight of that when we're talking about celebrity divorces. We focus on the drama, the money, but this is about real lives.
Real families trying to pick up the pieces. And, speaking of how people see this, we've talked about that Reddit thread a lot. What are your thoughts on how those comments are shaping the story?
It's really interesting how that Reddit thread is like a courtroom. You've got people analyzing everything, deciding who's right and who's wrong, and they're so passionate about it.
Yeah, and you can really see how public opinion has shifted against Brad Pitt.
Big time. So many of the comments are negative. People are angry, they're disappointed. Some are even saying he should face consequences, beyond just public opinion.
Yeah, it's intense. And it shows you how powerful social media can be, right? It can really shape how we see things, especially when it comes to celebrities. Makes you wonder, how is all of this going to affect Brad Pitt's career? Like, will Hollywood still want to work with him? We've seen other celebrities,
Yeah, they get canceled, basically.
Exactly.
It's hard to say what will happen.
Yeah.
Some stars, they manage to bounce back, but others,
their careers take a nosedive.
It'll be interesting to see what happens with him. But regardless of his career, this divorce has definitely had a huge impact on him, both personally and professionally.
No doubt. It reminds you that celebrities, even the biggest ones, they're still human. They have flaws, they make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes play out on a really public stage.
Absolutely. And while all the financial stuff and the gossip might grab our attention at first, we can't forget that there are real people at the heart of this.
Yeah, a family dealing with something incredibly difficult, and kids who are trying to make sense of it all, and it's all happening in front of the whole world.
Yeah. And that adds a whole other level of complication to it all.
So we've covered the financial settlement, the abuse allegations, the public's reaction, the kids. What stands out to you the most? Like, what are the big takeaways from all of this?
I think one of the biggest things is the difference between what the Daily Mail said and what we're seeing in those Reddit comments.
That's a good point. Like, the Daily Mail made it sound like Jolie came out on top, financially speaking, after a really tough fight. But the Redditors are focusing on something completely different.
Totally. They're talking about the abuse and what Jolie and the kids might have gone through.
It makes you realize that there are always different ways of looking at things.
Yeah. It makes you think about it, like, what's the real story here?
Yeah.
And it makes you question your own biases.
We get so caught up in the headlines and the gossip, but it's important to remember that these are real people, and what's happening to them has real consequences.
Absolutely. And this leads to the big question, what's going to happen next? How will this divorce affect other celebrity couples in the future? What can we learn from all of this?
Big questions, and we'll talk about them more in a minute. But first, there's something I've been thinking about this whole time, is how people saw Brad Pitt, before all of this came out, and how they see him now. It's crazy how much it's changed.
It really is. Like
Yeah.
he was the golden boy, right?
Yeah.
Everyone loved him.
Yeah, like Mr. Perfect. And it makes you wonder how much of that was real and how much was just, the image he was putting out there.
We only see what they want us to see, you know? It's all carefully planned.
Exactly. It's like we forget that celebrities are real people with real problems just like everyone else.
Right. It's easy to think they're living these perfect lives, but it's just not true.
So what's the lesson here? Maybe we shouldn't believe everything we see, especially when it comes to celebrities.
Yeah, it's important to be a little skeptical, I think. To remember that the media doesn't always show us the whole picture.
And we see that in this case, right? The way the Daily Mail talked about it versus what people are saying on Reddit. It's totally different.
It really is. And it shows you how powerful public opinion can be, especially with social media.
Like that Reddit thread, right? It's like everyone's got an opinion and they're not afraid to share it.
Yeah, and it can be hard to know what to believe sometimes. But it's important to think for yourself, to question things and to look at things from different perspectives.
We can't just accept everything we read or hear, especially online.
Exactly. So, thinking about all of this, what do you think? How might this divorce affect other celebrities down the line?
That's a good question. Like, will this change how these things are handled in the future?
Maybe. I mean, I think it's definitely made people more aware of these kinds of issues, especially when it comes to abuse allegations in high-profile divorces.
Yeah. All the attention on the accusations against Brad Pitt has gotten people talking about some important stuff, like who has the power in these situations? What's the media's role in all of this? And how do we support people who are speaking out about abuse?
Yeah, really important stuff. And it makes you realize that this isn't just about Hollywood. It's about how we as a society deal with these issues.
Exactly. Because even though this is a celebrity divorce, the stuff they're dealing with, it's something that a lot of people go through.
It is. Divorce, custody battles, the pain of a relationship ending. These are all things that people experience every day.
It's just that in this case, it's happening on a much bigger stage with the whole world watching.
Exactly. And it makes you think about how difficult that must be.
Okay, so as we wrap up, what are the biggest takeaways from all of this? What have we learned?
Well, for me, it's the difference between what we see in the media and what's actually happening.
Yeah.
It's a reminder to be critical, to not just take things at face value.
That's a good one. The Daily Mail painted one picture, but the Reddit comments painted a completely different one, and the truth is probably somewhere in between.
Right. It's complicated, and we have to be aware of our own biases when we're trying to figure it all out.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, this is about real people, real lives.
And we should never forget that.
So as we sign off, I just want to say, let's all try to be a little more understanding, a little more critical in how we approach these stories. And let's remember that even celebrities are human beings dealing with human problems.
Couldn't say it better myself.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Brangelina divorce. We hope it's given you something to think about, and maybe, just maybe, it'll make you look at the world a little differently.